Why, hello. Perhaps you have been listening to Wagner with great pleasure for the last 30 seconds. However, fortunately, I have not been. I've had these earphones on where I've been listening to the theme song from Gilligan's Island, and that's great because I hate Wagner. I cannot stand Wagner. Listening to Wagner elevates my blood pressure and constricts my stomach, and I can't stand the guy's music. And maybe you've been having a different response. Maybe inexplicably, Wagner makes you feel at one with the world, and maybe it slows down your heart rate and your breathing rate. Maybe you've increased your blood flow to your genitals if you're really weird. Maybe. Nonetheless, despite you perhaps liking Wagner and having all those responses and me loathing the guy's music, we have one thing in common, which is stuff is changing in our bodies. Different processes have changed. All sorts of things are working differently for a very simple reason. We've thought something. We've had some emotion. And we're suddenly dealing with this extraordinary fact, first emphasized in the last lecture, which is we humans are unique, are sophisticated enough that we could think of things, we could remember something from our childhood, we can feel an emotion evoked by a piece of music, we can do any of that, and we could change how our body works. A wonderful example of this. Now, there's been a lot made by gerontologists about this very striking fact of all sorts of orchestral conductors who live to be 120 and they're conducting way up to the end. And what's the explanation? One of the things that's emphasized is all the aerobic exercise you get conducting and that increasing your heart rate to an optimal range. Wonderful story. Apparently, a study was once done on Arturo Toscanini, and who was a great example of one of those lasting forever conductors, and where he was not getting all this aerobic exercise conducting. Instead, he was sitting and listening to one of his recordings, and his heart rate increased to the same extent as if he was conducting himself. What we've got here is a very dramatic example that have a thought, have an emotion, have a memory, and things change in your body. Your pancreas releases some hormone you've never even heard of. Your spleen is texting your thymus. Something's happening with blood flow in your big right toe. And what we have is this critical point that runs through everything coming following this, which is we have this capacity, again, as these sophisticated psychosocial humans, to turn on physiology with mere thought. So the question becomes, how do we do that? And broadly, there's two systems in the body responsible for it. The first, the nervous system, the way in which your brain can influence events throughout your body by way of the nervous system. The second, by way of hormones, the release of hormonal messengers. And what this lecture is about is getting a broad sense about how these two systems work, how they're regulated, and most importantly, what happens with these systems during stress. So to begin, that nervous system, that neural regulation by your brain of events throughout your body. To do this, you got to have a spinal cord. Now, most of your spine mediates boring stuff. It makes you sign checks and, shake hands and foxtrot and all sorts of things that you have voluntary control over. Where you were sending messages from your brain to your voluntary muscles, a system called, not shockingly, the voluntary nervous system. That's not the one that's critical for this lecture. Instead, we have a part of the nervous system that does the good stuff, the stuff you normally don't have much control over. Blushing and goose flesh and orgasms and pupillary contractions, the things that are typically automatic. And thus termed the automatic nervous system, or more formally, the autonomic nervous system. This is the means by which your nervous system changes events throughout your body by way of your spinal cord. Now, this autonomic nervous system comes in two halves, and that's going to be critical throughout the course as well. Two halves. First half, sympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic nervous system, all hell breaking loose, emergency, arousal, fight or flight, secreting adrenaline, the whole stress response, all of that, sympathetic arousal. In contrast, you have the second system, the parasympathetic nervous system, which mediates calm vegetative function. Eat a big starchy meal, you turn on the parasympathetic nervous system. Take a nap, you turn on the parasympathetic nervous system. Get disemboweled by a lion, you turn off the parasympathetic nervous system and turn on the sympathetic. For the most part, they work in opposition. And what we will see is stress and the stress response is all about turning on the sympathetic nervous system to an extremely severe extent, screamingly sympathetic tone in your body while turning off the parasympathetic. Now, how do these work? How do these regulate parts of your body? An example, your heart. We already know what the main sort of core of the cardiovascular stress response is about, which is you're that zebra running for your life. You need to increase your blood pressure and your heart rate to deliver more energy to your exercising muscles. So what happens with this autonomic nervous system at the level of your heart? You turn on the sympathetic nervous system and it speeds things up while you're decreasing parasympathetic tone. So in the heart, what the sympathetic nervous system is about is increasing activity. Meanwhile, in the last lecture, we learned another example of what happens in your body, the gastrointestinal tract. You will remember that business, you get stressed, you get nervous, your mouth gets dry. The first step of shutting down the whole gastrointestinal system, and what we've got there is a case where the sympathetic nervous system, the emergency arousal, is decreasing activation of this particular organ. So in order to pull off this emergency stress response business, as we saw before in the previous lecture, some organ systems you activate, some you inhibit, and it's the sympathetic nervous system that's predominantly responsible for this. Okay, so the question, of course, becomes, what regulates the sympathetic nervous system? What are the regulators of this broader autonomic nervous system? Now, there's parts of the brain where you decide voluntarily you're going to do this with your finger, and there's certain neurons, brain cells that have been identified that do that. What regulates all this stuff where you think about a memory from your childhood and your heart rate changes? What regulates this autonomic nervous system? And to begin to appreciate it, we need to pull in a concept, a wonderful one that has run through sort of the field of behavioral biology for some years, one originated by a man named MacLean, Paul MacLean, one of the giants in the field in the 1950s, what has come to be known as the triune brain. The triune brain, the three-layer version of the brain. Obviously, this is not what the brain is really about, but it's a way to conceptualize what's happening, particularly with respect to the autonomic nervous system. Now, you've got your first level of the triune brain, which is the part of your nervous system that has all these ancient pathways, your hypothalamus, all sorts of brainstem areas. Do not panic if those terms are new to you. The main point there is this is one of the most ancient parts of the brain. This is a part of the brain where, like a lizard, has virtually the same part of the brain there, the same regulatory sub-areas, the same projections. What's this part of the brain about? It's doing regulatory stuff. Your body gets cold, and there are sensors which send information up to this ancient reptilian part of the brain, and suddenly your muscles start shivering. You get some signal sent up there saying, oh, God, I'm bleeding, and before you know it, there are signals coming down, changing your cardiovascular tone, exactly the same in us as in a reptile. So we've got this first part of this triune brain way of thinking about the nervous system. Second layer, the limbic system. On top of the triune sort of reptilian section, limbic system. Limbic system is about emotion. Limbic system is about lust and rage and petulance and all that stuff. Limbic system is about mammals. Yeah, reptiles have a limbic system, fish, all those guys, but they don't have much of one. I mean, lizards are not renowned for their emotional lives. It's not till mammals that you get a really well-developed limbic system. And what's that doing? That's the moose that sees some other male moose dominating and trying to come into his territory with his antlers. If I don't know if moose actually have antlers, but some male doing some territorial threat, and you, the other male, being threatened, your heart rate increases. It is taking information about the world, which is emotional in nature, and turning it into a signal down to that reptilian part of the brain. And suddenly, your heart is beating faster, not because you're running and you're getting signals there, not because you're bleeding, but because you've seen something, you've thought something, you have had a strong emotion evoked. Sitting there on top, though, is the third most layer in this triune organization, the cortex. The cortex, this gleaming new part of the nervous system, the most recently evolved. Yes, once again, reptiles, fish, birds, they have a cortex. It is something that is not really elaborated until you get to mammals, and is not really elaborated until you get to primates. The cortex is about all that abstract stuff. Abstract reasoning, processing, long-term memories, all of that, and that becomes very pertinent here. Hemorrhage, and thanks to the reptilian brain, you turn on the stress response. See that menacing moose, and thanks to the limbic system, you turn on the stress response. Think about children in refugee camps. Think about ozone layers thinning out. Thinking about your eventual mortality. Thinking about a fictional character who evokes emotions in you. And suddenly, you might turn on the stress response. Suddenly, your cortex does a classically cortical thing, some abstract thought, and suddenly your heart is beating faster. Suddenly your breathing rate may have decreased. Suddenly your salivary glands are doing something different. Suddenly you've regulated your autonomic nervous system. And what that implies is, for one thing, what the cortex has is lots of ways of speaking to the limbic system and speaking to that reptilian part of the brain. You think a thought, and in some ways that reptilian part of the brain reacts as if you're hemorrhaging. Somehow it reacts as if this is a physiologically real event. And you better bet throughout this course, as we deal with us and our stressors, not our stressors being chased by predators, our stressors of psychosocial nature, what we're going to be dealing with is this ability of the cortex to do its abstract sort of thing, and suddenly your body reacts as if it was a real menace. This is another way of stating the central concept of the course. By the time we get to these psychosocially sophisticated humans and primates, we have that ability to change the body's functioning with thought, with emotion, with memory. And if it's the right kind of adverse thought, emotion, memory, and you do it chronically, you will be suffering from the consequences of activating your stress response too often. Now, in a lecture to come, in two, in fact, we will be dealing with one of the more interesting domains of what your cortex can do to the rest of your brain, your cortex thinking about extremely sad things. And suddenly, your body reacts differently. What's the building block we've just seen neuroanatomically? As we will see, this is a lot about what a depression is about. Obviously highly simplified, nonetheless, some sort of a sense of how to begin thinking about how the brain regulates psychosocial manifestations throughout the body. Okay, so that's our first half. Remember, we've got our two halves here. The first one, the nervous system regulating the autonomic, the automatic, the involuntary, the unconscious parts of your body by way of neural projections down your spine, this autonomic nervous system. And as we've heard, there's a second type of regulation, which is by way of hormones. Okay, hormones evoke a whole lot of fancy definitional stuff. Here's a hormone. Here's what it consists of. You've got, for example, a brain cell, a neuron, which dribbles out some chemical messenger. And it goes a thousandth of an inch until it hits the next neuron, and it changes something or other in that neuron's function. What you've got is a neurotransmitter. Now, instead, you have that neuron that secretes, say, the same exact chemical messenger, except this time, instead of going a tiny distance to the next neuron, it gets in the bloodstream, where it can circulate throughout the body and affect something going on in your ankles. And what we've just defined is a hormone. A hormone is a chemical messenger which can come from a brain cell or cells throughout the body, as we'll see, and it is blood-borne, and as a result, it can affect events throughout your body. So, of course, the question becomes, amid all of the hormones that are coming down the pike that we will learn about, and all of their consequences, some of which are bad news in the face of chronic stress, of course, the question now becomes, what regulates hormone release? The same sort of question as what regulates that autonomic nervous system, what regulates hormone release, and figuring out the answer to this has been a great chapter of history of physiology. So what regulates hormone release? Hormones come from glands. That's kind of a definition of a gland. A gland secretes hormones, chemical messengers that get blood-borne. A gland secretes hormones, glands like ovaries and testes and adrenals and thyroid, that sort of thing. So what tells them when to secrete their particular hormones? And what everyone thought they knew, endlessly, absolute, iconic textbook knowledge was, these glands know what they're doing. These glands are autonomous. These glands themselves decide, when am I going to secrete progesterone? When am I going to secrete thyroid hormone? The glands are self-regulating. The glands somehow know when to do their thing. And this was a dominant model around 1900, and in fact it gave rise to one of the truly weird chapters of endocrine history, and it had to do with aging. Okay, scientists at the time are trying to figure out what aging is about, and they're just figuring out at the time that there's some interesting hormonal stuff that comes out of the testes, testosterone. There's interesting stuff there. I don't think they had quite the term at that point. And the theory became, well, what causes aging? Aging is due to declining levels of testosterone, taking away your vigor. As we'll see, there's two problems to that. One is that this, in fact, is not entirely the case what goes on, and testosterone does not play this role. Second problem is that it ignores aging in like 51% of the population. Oh, those folks without testes. But in any case, this is what all those aging male scientists focused on at the time. So if you believe, number one, that declining testosterone levels with aging have a lot to do with the aging process, number two, that the testes know what they're doing, they decide when to secrete the testosterone, and thus aging testes are not as good as secreting it, you come up with what was state-of-the-art medicine at the time, which is give some guy a new set of testes. And what was done during this magical era of endocrinology is people would have bits of goat testes or monkey testes transplanted, put under their skin, where in the view at the time, the testes would be off and running, these new ones with young, vigorous amounts of testosterone release, and that would just reverse the aging process. This was all the rage. Captains of industry, heads of state would go off to fancy sanitariums to get themselves their monkey gland extract. This was known as the monkey gland phenomenon because people at the time were not allowed to say outrageous, blasphemous terms like testes, but this was the monkey gland craze. And it turns out that none of this is what was going on because your testes don't know what they're doing, nor do your ovaries, nor do your kidneys or your thyroid or your adrenals. These glands, these peripheral glands, turned out not to be autonomous. In other words, they were not deciding when to secrete their hormones. Someplace else in the body was doing this. And thus we transition to the next level of regulation. Of course, you may ask, why were all of these guys, nonetheless, after they were getting their monkey gland transplants, why were they reporting these wondrous effects and rejuvenating? I think what we have is this grand placebo effect. You go to this place, you pay a ton of money, and they transplant all sorts of distressing monkey parts into your butt. You've got a strong incentive at that point to suddenly feel like a young stud again, one big placebo effect. Okay, so the peripheral glands don't know what they're doing. What does? We transition up at this point to the pituitary gland. And by the 1940s, 1950s, what became clear is it was the pituitary secreting its whole array of hormones, which would then go in the bloodstream and tell the various glands what to do, tell them when to secrete their hormones. And this gave rise to one of the great sound bites of physiology, and this was what the pituitary was. And in fact, I endlessly encountered this, like lots of folks in my generation. I grew up reading the Reader's Digest in the bathroom, and amid all their articles, they had this one continuing series, I am Joe's liver, I am Joe's stomach, I am Joe's heart, I am Joe's ovaries, this whole sort of series of articles they had, and somewhere in there, eventually you would get the I am Joe's pituitary. And out would come the inevitable soundbite there, which is the pituitary is the master gland. Turns out, the pituitary isn't the master gland. And by the 1950s, top people in the field were realizing the pituitary doesn't know what it's doing on its own. It is not autonomous. It's getting directions from someplace else. And this shifted to what at the time was an outrageous notion, which is the brain is the master gland. The brain is releasing hormones that tell the pituitary what hormones to release, which tell the peripheral glands. This was outrageous at the time because endocrinology had this somewhat sort of lowbrow feel to this. And neurobiologists, brain scientists did not like the notion one bit that this gleaming, analytical, computer-like brain actually was like drooling hormones out of some gland. This seemed very unappetizing, and it took a huge amount of time for people to actually prove that the brain, specifically the hypothalamus, a part of the brain that sits just above the pituitary, the hypothalamus releases hypothalamic hormones, which tell the pituitary what to do. The search for hypothalamic hormones was this grand race between two individuals, two scientists, one named Andrew Shalley, the other named Roger Guillemin, who started off working together, and presumably one night over the test tubes, one of them made a snide comment about the other one's hairdo or something. They broke up this collaboration, and they began one of the great competitions in science, the competition to isolate the first hypothalamic hormones. And it took them years and years and years. And because these imaginary hormones, as far as everybody else was concerned, these imaginary hormones, if they existed, were in such tiny amounts because all they had to do was just go down here and tell the pituitary what it does. All it needed to do was travel a half inch or so, that there wasn't going to be much of the stuff. How do you isolate it? How do you prove the stuff is there? And these guys had to pioneer these approaches of getting thousands of pig hypothalami that they got from stock houses and cow hypothalami, where they would then extract various factors from there and throw them onto pituitaries that were sitting in petri dishes and see if the pituitary suddenly did something different that made sense. Aha, somewhere in this thimble full of stuff we poured in, there's this hypothalamic factor that's relevant. Huge amount of work, all of this competing for who got contracts with which stockyards, grad students in each of the two labs sort of not talking to the ones from the other ones. Huge competition amid this great skepticism as to whether these hypothalamic hormones even existed, and it took them years and decades, and eventually they showed that the hypothalamus is the master gland, and you better bet the limbic system and the cortex is telling the hypothalamus when to secrete its particular hormones that tell the pituitary what to do, which then tells the peripheral glands. And these two guys got their Nobel Prizes for doing so. And bizarrely, you might ask what would seem to be a simple question is, well, which of them won the race? Which got there first? And it depends on quite how you define winning, and I won't go into the details of that, because whoever I wind up casting a vote for, folks on the other side of the argument will come and stab me for doing so. But this was a major landmark event showing how the brain is the thing that ultimately regulates hormones, the endocrine system. And thus you have what are now termed axes, endocrine axes. You can have the ovarian axis, where the brain secretes a particular hormone, which tells the pituitary to secrete its particular hormone, which goes to the ovaries, and suddenly out comes estrogen. Or you can have the thyroid axis. The brain secretes a different hormone, which gets the pituitary to secrete a different one and gets the thyroid gland to secrete thyroid hormone. These endocrine axes. Okay. So we've got all of this working that way. Mind you, there's a few exceptions. Not all hormones are under the control of the brain, but for our purposes, the hypothalamus to pituitary to peripheral gland sequence is what we will work with. And what we will work with also is that notion of the limbic system and cortex telling the hypothalamus when to secrete its hormones, along with limbic and cortical influences on that autonomic nervous system. So, how do these things wind up working? What you've got are an array of hormones which constitute the stress response and an array of autonomic components. And what we'll go over now is the major players in the stress response. And I cannot possibly emphasize too much at this point, do not panic. Do not panic when hearing these terms. If they are important, you will hear the names of these hormones a gazillion times in the lectures to come. This is merely just to introduce the first players. Do not even dream of writing them down. So which hormones are secreted during the stress response? We've already heard that the sympathetic nervous system is turned on, and the main hormone that it regulates is adrenaline, also known as epinephrine in the United States, typically known as epinephrine. In England, Commonwealth countries as adrenaline. Comes out of the adrenal glands. Sympathetic nervous system sends a message to the adrenals. Out comes adrenaline, epinephrine. Next major player, a class of steroid hormones that come out of the adrenal glands as well, called glucocorticoids. And I happen to be in love with glucocorticoids because I've spent the last 30 years studying them. Human version, hydrocortisone, we are going to hear tons more about these. Other players that get secreted, increased secretory rates during stress, prolactin, glucagon, beta-endorphin, we will get back to these. Meanwhile, in the next county, there are the hormones whose secretion is inhibited during stress. The parasympathetic nervous system, hormones like growth hormone, insulin, the reproductive hormones, we will see how all of these pieces fit together. Couple of final qualifiers here. Everything that I described here as the classic stress response is built around bringing about the classic cliched soundbite about what the stress response is about. Something mentioned earlier, it is turning on the flight or fight response, the fight or flight. Whatever the number of F's are in there, this was the classical picture, first pulled together by Walter Cannon, one of the godfathers of stress physiology back in the 20s. The stress response is about emergency, arousal, fighting, fleeing. But it turns out that's not what always happening. And a few years ago, a scientist named Shelley Taylor began to point out that this may be an artifact by scientists spending way too much time studying this weird subset of subjects, males. The stress response in males is predominantly about fight or flight. In females, it can be in lots of species doing affiliative behaviors, running and making sure your kids are okay, that sort of thing mediated by completely different hormones. And just showing she means business, Taylor came up with a soundbite of her own. Often what the stress response is about is tend and befriend. So we've just made the picture a little bit more complicated. Some of it is about fight or flight, some of it tend and befriend, but nonetheless, we've now gotten the major players. Increased secretion of epinephrine, glucocorticoids, glucagon, prolactin, those guys. Decreased activation of the parasympathetic nervous system, growth hormone. Again, we are going to hear more about all of these. Couple of final qualifiers as well. What I'm implying here is with any sort of stressor,